saying like that's so fancy in your slide.
Yeah, it is.
It's actually like it's really useful for explaining, like it's a great link for explaining exactly what we're trying to tell them. So I thought just opening it, and it's short, like I won't actually read them the whole thing or anything like that.
Perfect. If it doesn't work, we'll certainly try to share the slides with everyone. And let me know if anyone's objecting. Our speakers have graciously agreed to allow us to record, but if someone wants to ask a question, they don't want that recorded, let us know. We can try to edit it before we save. But we are planning to record this for future use. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for being here this evening. I know everyone has lots going on, and we're all tend to be zoomed out, but we thought this was an important topic. My name is Asad Rahman. I'm a former president of the DFW Muslim Bar, former president of the National Association of Muslim Lawyers, and former president of my student council in high school. Just so you know. I currently work as a vice president and assistant general counsel at JP Morgan. That's not why I'm here. I've had the opportunity to serve as a nonprofit pro bono legal counsel for numerous Muslim organizations and other humanitarian and nonprofit organizations here in Dallas and around the nation. And so the topic that we're talking about today really is very crucial, near and dear to my heart, because I often know how to help organizations get set up initially, but then when they want to do work overseas, I don't know where to send them or how to begin. I want to thank the DFW Muslim Bar Association and especially the Muslim Bar Association of Houston. We'd actually started talking about doing this before what happened in Gaza. This was in light of what happened in Morocco and Libya, the natural disasters, and the need for people to want to do something. Obviously, the situation and our focus has changed a little bit in terms of what's happening in Gaza. Our prayers go out to the people there. I think everybody wants to feel like they're doing something. Mashallah, I've seen really a lot of activism from our Muslim lawyers across the nation, both in terms of know your rights and advocacy. And we just thought this is another really important topic, navigating international charitable giving, because people both want to be able to donate safely and legally, but we as attorneys are often called on to advise our organizations on, what they can do, what they cannot do. So I'm hoping this presentation will be useful to you. In light of the World Series or the baseball win the other day, the Rangers thrashing of the Astros, DFW and Muslim Bar of Houston have managed to keep the peace. We'll fight it out later, but Alhamdulillah, it's been a great collaboration. I'm going to let the speakers introduce themselves. I think they'll tell you the best about why they're here, and I think it's a really esteemed panel. I'm really honored to moderate. I'll start with Fatima.
Hi, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thanks so much to Murtaza for inviting me to join this, and thanks to Asad and both bar associations. I grew up in the Dallas area, although now I live in Washington, D.C. I'm a partner at Shepherd Mullen. I did serve as our Capital Area Muslim Bar Association president a couple of years back. My practice focuses on export controls, economic sanctions, anti-money laundering, foreign investment issues, anti-corruption issues. So I'm really going to speak from that angle. A lot of times we think, when we are giving money, transferring money to international organizations or even domestic organizations that may touch on other countries around the world, what are the issues, what are the risks? So hopefully I'll be able to share some insights from that perspective.
Safia?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I am Associate Counsel at Islamic Relief. I've been here for a little over 2 years. Before that, I was at a public defender's office, also in-house in the Bronx. And before that, I was at a couple law firms and started off in corporate law. I focus on a lot of different things. As Associate Counsel, we have a small legal department, but a big part of my work is sanctions compliance. And once I did cold call Fatima.
That was so fun.
Export control issue. So I get a lot of interesting questions come my way, but sanctions at this point I've looked at for a little while. Yeah.
And then Shaheen, formerly known as Murtaza.
At least we got this problem solved, although I think it's pretty easy to tell us apart. Hi guys, I'm Shaheen Haji Zuver. Thank you all for listening to me and inviting me, Murtaza. I have known Murtaza for, since 2004. So we also worked at the same law firm. And then I ended up going to the US government. So my angle on this will be sort of how the US government often sees these things or what red flags they're looking for. Ways to make sure you donate your money in a way that it gets to the places you really want it to go. And to make sure that when you do that, you don't that unnecessarily run afoul of something accidentally. Because one thing that we do see is people who are very well intentioned make one small mistake, and that can be really, really difficult to rectify. And so that's sort of my position or the angle that I will be coming from today.
And last but not least, Murtaza.
Assalamualaikum, everyone. I have the moment at my door when you do Zoom from home, you get your kids knocking on the door. So they just started. So I apologize if you hear that in the background. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to Dallas Fort Worth Muslim Bar Association for sponsoring this. I think this is our first event together. So inshallah, one of many. Thank you to all the speakers. I think I'm connected to everyone. So that's my secret. I have really smart friends. So I'm glad that everyone was able to be on the panel. Just briefly, I'm a partner at Edward Sudderwala Samani. And then I worked in big law in DC. And then I went overseas and worked in the Middle East. So sort of have a perspective on international NGOs and sort of the, some of the locations that a lot of Muslim Americans are donating overseas and the problems that are faced over there. In addition, I took a year and a half as a sabbatical to work at the Texas AG's office. I was a deputy AG for legal counsel there. And one of the divisions that I oversaw was the financial litigation and charitable trust division of the state of Texas. So I'll talk a little bit about state enforcement and what to worry about and what not to worry about. Thank you.
Great. I think we'll dive right in. Inshallah, we've got a few slides to share with you, and then we'll open it up to questions. I might ask questions here and there as well. But our first speaker will be Fatima, and I'll go to the first slide. These are some of the areas we're going to cover today, which our speakers mentioned. So the federal, the regulatory framework, practical issues, and then federal and state level, issues that arise when in this area.
So I just want to kind of level set on when we think about sanctions. There's a lot of talk of sanctions when we think about sanctioned countries, certain sanctioned individuals. But to kind of give you just a high level overview about how OFAC administers sanctions, there's a lot of different sanctions programs, and they're all very different in scope and nature. The enforcement agencies involved at the federal level are the U.S. Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, which usually enforce on the civil side, and then DOJ if there are criminal violations of sanctions laws. Next one. And there's lots of different types of sanctions. The import and export of goods, the import and export of services, blocked persons or blocked property. Sometimes, we see this in the Russia sanctions where certain transactions are prohibited just with certain types of entities, like in the energy sector, defense sector, and you can prohibit facilitation. So as a U.S. person, you cannot facilitate a transaction that you would not be able to do yourself. And I say this just to highlight that the reason why you see so many banking violations and issues when it comes to U.S. banks is because it really is a prohibited export of a service involving a sanctioned country. So there might be a financial transaction that very briefly touches on the U.S., but it gets caught up in a sanctions issue because there's U.S. dollars involved, and the U.S. government's going to see that as a correspondent bank providing some sort of service to either a sanctioned country or sanctioned individual. Asset freezes, again, like when persons are blocked, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, and I know Safia will cover specially designated nationals. That's always on everyone's mind as well, because if there's a blocked person, basically, any transaction with those blocked persons could be violation. Next one. I also wanted to kind of touch on the comprehensive versus targeted sanctions. So when we talk about comprehensive sanctions, they're really like countries where virtually every commercial transaction is prohibited involving that country. And currently that's Cuba, Iran, Syria, North Korea, and the covered regions of Ukraine. And then there are a lot of targeted sanctions where certain, it's the government or certain sectoral sanctions that I mentioned. There's a lot of sanctions programs that are trying to target programs, right? The war on terror and weapons proliferation. And usually how those are administered is by designating entities or designating individuals. And then there are list-based sanctions, people around the world that are designated. And I think we've all, maybe you've, had encountered this in some way, shape, or form in your profession. I will say, because a lot of times we talk about blacklists, like, oh, and, there's the no-fly list, and there's blacklist, and then there's the SDN list. And the issue, I think, as a Muslim community that we face, like my dad's name is Tahir Ali, and his passport, like there's so many common names that that pop up, like, and I've seen it a lot happen where there's a bank who like stops the transaction, and it because there's a name that gets a positive hit on one of these list-based sanctions. But it is really important to remember that each sanctions program also has a bunch of exemptions and general licenses that are issued, particularly many that are issued for humanitarian reasons and for temporary general licenses that are issued in times of crisis, like the earthquake relief. So I want to just kind of explain how these general licenses work, because they're basically for use for everyone. And some of the concerns that we have is like, okay, I want to send relief. Is my transfer going to get blocked? Like, is the bank going to say no? Like, what is going to happen? And then am I going to be put on some list or some sort of watch? And what I've found helpful, and I know Sophie is going to talk about some of the practical elements and strategies too, is to really have some, like, if you are an organization that uses these general licenses a lot, kind of have like some stock language that you're going to explain, that you're going to provide with your transaction, that this is subject to this general license. OFAC is issued, and we understand it is authorized because XYZ. But these, for humanitarian reasons, there are a lot of general licenses. The one in the middle is for Syria, but it is important to remember that each sanctions program is different. So there is not a general license for humanitarian purposes that's like forever general license for Iran, but there is one to support some certain NGOs' activities for Syria. So
do the nonprofits apply for those licenses
themselves?
No,
so these are general licenses that are available for use, and Safia can speak a little bit too. I don't know if you relied on this general license for Syria, but essentially banks should be allowed to process transactions under the scope of these general licenses to anyone, right? So if we as individuals are donating to an organization that's providing relief under the scope of this general license, typically that's a domestic transaction, right? So we're just providing our money to a domestic organization. But if you're providing to an international organization, it should still be authorized under a general license, as long as the activities are within the scope identified by OFAC. And then the next slide, I talk a little bit about specific licenses, because general licenses are for use for all people under the sanctions programs. The idea is we want to support, as the US government wants to support policies that are consistent with national security, that are consistent with human rights protection around the world. And then they have specific licensing policy, which means that you have to apply for a specific license to OFAC, but there will be a favorable kind of licensing policy related to certain activities. So you would have to apply for a license. And really, this is not so much for individuals, but mostly if you're working with an organization that wants to apply for an OFAC license. But OFAC has kind of issued within its regulations a statement saying, we are more likely to grant these specific licenses as long as the activities are within these general parameters. I'll turn it over to Safia to talk about some of the practical challenges and strategies that you use as individuals and as an organization. So,
great, thanks. So I'm approaching this issue as in-house counsel at a nonprofit organization, US-based organization, 501c3, that makes a lot of grants to either to other US-based organizations that then execute programming in these high-risk areas like Syria, Gaza, Yemen, Ethiopia, Sudan, or we also make grants to our primary partner organization, which is a UK-based nonprofit, Islamic Relief Worldwide, which then executes programming in all over the world in many different countries. So we're concerned with even though we're not the ones who are actually executing the programming. We are still concerned with sanctions compliance because it's our money. This is like we're making grants of millions of dollars to other organizations, and we have to ensure that none of the money is ultimately going to a prohibited party, to someone on the SDN list, for example, or that it would go to fund an activity that is not permitted under the sanctions regulations. So I consult pretty frequently with the sanctions regulations, which were on one of the previous slides. You could, it's 31 CFR 500 through 599. I do look frequently at the Syria sanctions regulations, and also the global terror sanctions regulations and the foreign terrorist organization sanctions regulations. I look at those. I've been looking at those a lot recently, but sometimes I do have to look at the other ones depending on the country. So that's just a general lay of the land of what I'm doing. But when we make these grants, even if we know that the activity is generally permitted under a general license, such as the one for NGO activity in Syria, for example, we still want to make sure that none of the funds can go to someone on the SDN list, because that's not authorized under these general licenses. Like, even if the activity is okay, it still can't go to someone who's on this list. And so what we do is we will screen, we'll request information about, vendors, for example, who are downstream, or sub-grantees, and we get that information and we perform screening ourselves. Not all INGOs do that, but we're pretty careful, and so we perform screening ourselves, and we also require in the grant agreement that that our grantees also perform screening, so that they're careful about where the money goes as well. And there isn't really a dollar threshold. It's not as if there's a sort of like a minimum, or I guess like a safe harbor. Like, if you give like $50 or less, then it's okay. I mean, I don't think OFAC is really going to go after a small diversion of funds, but because there isn't any dollar amount is problematic. One question is always, who are you screening? Like, every single vendor? What if it's just someone who's getting like a very small amount of money? Like, the question is, well, if it's a small amount of dollars, like, is that significant in that currency? So these are questions that we wrestle with when developing our sanctions compliance policy. Like, you want to balance compliance with U.S. law and risk management with actually being able to carry out these programs, because if you're doing emergency relief, like, do we really have the capacity to perform all these screenings in a very short time frame? Is that something that like our partners will agree to? So these are it's kind of a gray area, or I'd say it's kind of dependent on what the organization's risk appetite is, like who they're going to screen, how frequently. You can do a manual screening and when we do these screenings, they're on these different, like, there's a lot of different softwares out there. So there's like Dow Jones, for example, makes a pretty good software for screening. And so you can do manual screening like every once in a while, or on a maybe an annual basis, or whatever you've kind of determined to be sufficient, or you can have like continuous screening, so that if in a very dynamic situation like with Russia, for example, the banks keep getting added, right? These banks, because they're owned by some oligarch. And so it's not as if like OFAC is the government sanctioning them all at once. It's kind of like a trickle. This one's sanctioned here, then this one's sanctioned there. And so one bank might be okay to bank with in February, and then like 2 months later, they're on the SDN list. So in that case, continuous screening is advisable. But developing the program is really specific to the organization, and its risk appetite, where it's operating. It really just depends. And Also, as an Islamic Relief or a Muslim organization, we try to be extra careful because then we know that we're subject to extra scrutiny. And so in terms of interpreting the sanctions regulations, OFAC does encourage people, organizations, individuals to reach out to them for clarification. It's not always very effective because sometimes they don't give you the answer you're looking for. They just kind of give some sort of repeat what the regulation says, and so it's not always helpful, but there are avenues to get interpretive guidance, for example, or apply for a specific license where it's like tailored to your specific situation. But I'll say OFAC has been making an effort in the last 2 years to do a lot of outreach to the nonprofit sector. They've been holding like NGO roundtables and answering questions in that setting as well. Also, joining OFAC's mailing list is important to sort of keep on top of the changes to the sanctions regulations. And of course, you always reach out to outside counsel to check if, if there's something that's not clear. Like, we always reach out to outside counsel to make sure that we are understanding the regulations properly. We can go to the next slide.
Can I ask you a couple of
Yeah,
questions? You
go
answered
ahead.
one of them. I was wondering how willing OFAC is to give guidance. I know for other clients, I've tried to get regulatory guidance from an agency, and they'll just like, go do it. So you mentioned that, and then you mentioned extra scrutiny for Islamic Relief. Is that from the community, or do you mean like from the government? You feel like as an
I mean, I
Islamic
think
organization?
post 9/11, I think a lot of Muslim-run nonprofits are just very careful. Like, we just assume
Sure.
the government is watching what we do, right? And so, so we go above and beyond to make sure that we're as far away from the line as possible. But obviously, we want to carry out our programming as well. But yeah, I mean, I think OFAC, sometimes they've been responsive on like some questions they've not been helpful, and it's kind of like, well, do we proceed or not? They're not telling us whether. It's kind of like, do we accept the risk? And so sometimes it's not very clear.
I mean, I'll just add the one thing, and I think that's tough, and even in this situation with gut, is that you don't ever have clarity. If you might be working with certain individuals or entities, you don't know their relationships, and like what it seems, right? And the government is working from perspective of, so they're not going to show up on a screening list if they're like owned 50% more owned, or they have links to other SDNs. And so we're working with like a limited amount of information, was the government has like the CIA, all this intelligence, and to know about those relationships. So Sophia, to your point about like the extra scrutiny, like I do think that you're always nervous, right? Like when if you're transferring money in and out of any high risk country, and not just sanctioned countries, but countries that are considered high risk, right, by the U.S. government, those are types of things. So you do have to balance, like, you don't want to overdo your diligence. Like we should be able to be comfortable, but kind of understand there's a lot of unknowns out there.
Does anyone else want to talk about AML risk?
It's not
really, yeah, I would just say it's not really something that comes up too much for us.
So I can talk about it from a regulatory perspective. Generally speaking, what will happen is U.S. government agencies work closely together and share AML information. So, for example, say the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, Treasury, OCC, all of these agencies do share information about where they see AML risks. Now, how they put together their risk assessments, where they're looking for risk, is different by virtue of whatever agency it is. But then they do have, sometimes biannual, sometimes annual meetings to talk about where they're seeing issues. And the key is to they usually tend to release meeting notes or something like that. And there are certain triggers that, will always show up in AML type situations. As mentioned earlier, money going to countries that are always on a list of, we're worried about where this money is going. Anything that triggers a SAR, a suspicious activity report, which is usually a transaction of more than $10,000 or more. And that automatically requires a bank to send notice to Treasury. So that's the kind of thing to watch out for. Obviously, we know none of you are planning to launder money, but in order to make sure that you don't get monitored for that, you want to make sure that you're doing this in a really, really careful way. Do not associate your money with any organization that could actually have AML programs, or do not transfer money to an organization that has AML programs, or also do not transfer money to an organization that may then forward transfer it to any other organization that has AML issues. So I think in terms of AML, the real lesson here is know where your money is going, because the government is watching where your money is going.
Yeah, Shaheen, and you mentioned, and I don't know, but like just the idea right now, like in the current climate, if you want to donate, you mentioned something like don't pool money to some random uncle or
Yeah,
mosque.
I think we have that in a further bullet, because I have a whole spiel on that one.
Okay, yeah, just
Right.
to try to I guess stick with known entities, but you'll talk about that.
Yeah. We're gonna get there. Don't worry.
What about hawalas? And when we were preparing, this was the first time I'd heard that word hawalas. Can maybe someone speak to what those are and speak a
I
little bit
mean,
about
I can talk about it a little bit. So hawalas are basically it's non-traditional banking. So it's between two parties who can be in different parts of the world, where they're keeping track of there's no money actually going between the parties. There's no money moving, but they're using ledgers to basically keep a balance. And so the problem with hawalas, or I'd say, first of all, they're used in a lot of places. So in Afghanistan, they're very common. In Syria, I don't know if they're used in Pakistan, but they're not, they're especially in areas where there aren't a lot of banking services, or if there's not a lot of trust in the government. They are used because there's a sort of a local person who people trust, and so it's kind of like reputational. And the problem is that it's also used sometimes in a money laundering context, and so it does trigger an AML concern by banks. So that's in terms of whether a bank is willing to carry out a transaction like a money transfer to a country like Syria or Afghanistan. They might ask questions like, do you use hawalas? That question has come up for us before. And so we have to, respond in the affirmative or negative, like if a hawala is ever going to be involved in our grants, and that would be additional risk for them, because it is generally considered a way to do money laundering, because you can't really track the money as well.
And it gets used a lot, like as Safia was saying, in the Middle East. Started off as just it's a pretty there's some stories about anecdotally that a lot of like family members originally from South Asia sort of migrated with colonialism and so forth westward. So it is sort of ingrained a lot in South Asia, Middle East, Muslim countries, as far as like Somalia, for example. And many people see it as like a very quick and easy way of just transferring money without having to go through formal processes. And a lot of the countries we'll talk about have capital restrictions on money that can come in and out, right? So you want to get money to your family members and stuff like that. But again, part of it was after 9/11, when a lot of more scrutiny came on transactions, there was a thought from regulatory in the West that these hawalas were just being used, to elicit terrorist financing and stuff like that. And that is a theme that we'll talk about later, that terrorist financing is the bogey word that gets used a lot, and yeah, it does exist. I'm not denying it, but at the same time, a lot of cases come up in other countries with the pretext of terrorist financing to stop, helpful causes or charitable causes.
Yeah, and I'll also add that
next?
sometimes the exchange rate can be more favorable also using a hawala dar than formal channels.
Should I go to the next slide?
So one of the consequences of the over compliance of banks in terms of ensuring that there's no money laundering and to prevent involvement in terrorist financing, as Mortez just mentioned, is basically essentially a lack of financial access for nonprofits. So banks, it's not really in their financial interest to carry out a transaction that's high risk, right? Because they don't want to risk getting fined by OFAC or, violating some other law. And so, because it is strict liability to participate in a prohibited transaction like that. And so, what some banks do is they just won't bank with, certain individuals or organizations, or they won't carry out transactions. And even if they're willing to carry out, you find a bank that's willing to carry out a wire, like your own bank, like for an organization, a correspondent bank may not be willing to, participate in that transaction. And so it can be really difficult for organizations to carry out projects in high risk areas like Syria or Afghanistan. And it's not because the law doesn't allow the transaction, it's because these banks don't want to participate in them. So there's this practical hurdle that nonprofits have to face sometimes. And, it takes a lot of like personal relationships and persuading your representative at the bank to it's like, come on, there's an earthquake. We really need to carry out this transaction. Like people are dying. And sometimes they'll just be like, nope, we don't bank in Syria anymore. We're not gonna carry on transaction to Syria. It's just our new like policy. So this can be challenging for nonprofits and something we have to deal with quite frequently. And then I'll just very quickly, we're not getting into the material support statute violations, but that is also a concern if you are providing any sort of service or good to someone, to a designated foreign terrorist organization, such as Hamas, for example. In that case, like you're not only concerned with OFAC fining you, but also, potential civil or criminal penalties, and that's enforced by the Department of Justice. So that's also a big hindrance for nonprofit organizations. Or, we're very concerned about violating that as well because, there's no like safe harbor there.
Can you speak a little bit about the types of penalties? You said civil, criminal, but are we talking jail time, significant sentences? Whenever it's civil penalties, is it against the donors, the organization? What if the organization doesn't have the money? How does that handle usually?
I mean, I know that through this has come up recently through some False Claims Act litigation where the DOJ intervenes, where a nonprofit organization has, it ends up being false claim because they have to make this affirmation when they get a USAID grant saying they haven't like engaged in any material support of, terrorists. And, if they have done that, even if unrelated to USAID grant, someone can, a private party can, bring this False Claims Act lawsuit, and DOJ can intervene. And I mean, I've seen nonprofits try to settle this type of litigation for like, over $1 million. They don't have a lot of money, but like the litigation is so expensive that clearing their name might be more expensive. But sometimes they just have to bite the bullet. Yeah, I mean, there are organizations that are trying to get nonprofits in trouble. They have a particular political agenda, and so but that's like only through False Claims Act litigation. But I don't know if DOJ I'm not really following like their general enforcement of this otherwise. But I don't know if any of the other panelists can speak to that.
Well, no, I mean, obviously the Holy Land Foundation case was a case, right, that brought this to the forefront. But yes, there can be criminal. The tough part is it freaks you out, right? You're like, but really, I mean, there has to be pretty egregious, I think, to go into the criminal a DOJ violation. But I don't know, Murtaza, if you want to speak also to that, just from your time. Like you said, like the boogie word, right, is terrorist financing, and it'd be like material support for a terrorist organization. But I would, to get into the criminal subject to criminal liability is a we would think a high threshold.
There was a flyer just somebody had shared a few weeks ago in one of our numerous Muslim WhatsApp groups about that. I think I want to say either the Palestinian legal group had put together or CARE, but just talking about material support and where the law has changed. I think a holder there's a recent case, maybe about 6-7 years old, regarding material support, and I think it was like, I mean, it scared me because it was like a tweet in support of an organization, and that was imputed to being support. So there is some scary stuff there, right? In regards to terrorist financing, I mean, it's there. I mean, I think that's pushed a lot of the rules we're seeing, in terms of SARs and just sort of more. I mean, I said in the banking industry, you probably you see this a lot in your space, just a lot of reporting and flags. I know somebody shared one of the Dallas Fort Worth Muslim Bar members, Rahila. She shared a talk on Corporate Transparency Act of 2024. So the landscape is changing a lot. And trying to figure out who's where and what. Funny, from I was talking about working in the Middle East. I was at a point when I was there, my years were like at the middle of the Arab Spring happening. And I remember like openly people were like collecting money for like Nusra Front, and I mean, not me, but but people that I was like, at work, because at that point in Saudi Arabia, Nusra Front was seen as an ally, right, of many organizations. So it was just surreal, right? I mean, and then you had sort of Muslims collecting zakat for helping an organization, and they get thrown with something. So it's not to say that America has their political agenda in some of these prosecutions. It exists probably everywhere in the world. And when you're giving money overseas, I think we just want to reiterate to everyone that you're stepping into something here, but you're also maybe stepping into something overseas. The Khashoggi stuff and the lawyers who represented him. I think if people are familiar with that, somebody touches down, a connecting flight through Dubai or Doha, and you get picked up by Secret Service, from those countries. I mean, those are realities when you make these donations. So again, not to scare everyone, but it is scary. I mean, to be fair, the world that we operate in, with donations coming from here and back.
I would love to get your thoughts on, like, right now, when you think about like the Palestinian organizations that are on the ground versus, because there's a lot of conversation in our firm, like, okay, well, we're going to pick like World Central Kitchen and International, like but there are Palestinian relief organizations on the ground that they're legit. And like, I don't know if you've heard or like what your thoughts are on, donating to those like dollar transactions or non-dollar, maybe not US dollar transactions.
So, okay.
Yeah.
Martha, go ahead and then I'll jump in.
No, I was just going to point to Safia because I think your organization is wonderful for that. I was just going to point to that. That's all I was going to say.
Okay, then Safia, you go in, and then I'll jump ahead after.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think when you're operating in a place like that, there's risk, right? The risk is never going to be zero, right? But it's all about, like, does the organization, is it local? Does it know who they're working with? Like, do they know who the good guys and bad guys are, right? So you want to make sure, usually organizations that are working locally, they do have that knowledge, right? They know where the money should go and where it shouldn't go. But you can never eliminate risk 100%. That's just unrealistic.
So I see Farah. They've been talking a little bit about Farah, what that is and what that implies.
I added to the slides. If anyone wants to add, please jump in. It's a Cold War era law that got passed. It was sort of unknown for many decades. It was used initially. Soviet Union. Spies were seen, and you need to register yourself. And then I want to say DOJ had an inspector general report not too long ago, maybe about a half a decade ago, and just basically said that DOJ is really not enforcing FARA as much as they could, and then lo and behold, then Russiagate sort of came up with a lot of Special Counsel Mueller's investigations, and we saw, like, I think the total prosecutions up to that point had been like a handful, and then out of that spun out a bunch of failure to register, and sort of related to the previous administration. One that stood out to me as lawyers was Skadden Arps, was prosecuted for FARA violations regarding their Ukraine lobbying work. And it's like Skadden Arps, right? Like, it's like, this is not like, one solo law firm or anything like that. Uh, I'm not saying that solo law firms create problems, but I'm just saying, like, I mean, the reputation that they had, and they took it. I mean, they took the deal, right? And many corporate, clients will do that. Take the plead to it. But again, it's just sort of like the work, that you do. And the real thing here is if you're seen, the law is vague enough in many ways, right? That if you're seen to be representing a foreign government, a foreign principal, or coordinating, and I think that's the word that the legal sort of academic literature talks about, is coordinating with a foreign principal, which, how do you define coordinating, right? That can come up. And part of what Safia is mentioning, right? Scrutiny. It's not necessarily that they're going to come after you or somebody's going to look at you for OFAC violations or sanctions violations. They're going to look at your totality of your organization, right? Like, how are your tax returns? What kind of grants are you taking? Where else are you involved? So this is something that there could be emails between you and a foreign organization, and does that deem? And there are exceptions. I don't want to say that any donation is covered by FARA or any legal work is, but there are, when you go over the line, that's when the FARA unit can get involved.
Yeah, and we've looked into FARA compliance as well, because when you work with other non-US organizations, the law is seems pretty broad. But and so one scenario would be if you work with another nonprofit organization and you're coordinating meetings on the Hill, for example, with them, and to try to get funding for them or something like that. That's like a situation where you may want to look into FARA registration. But yeah, enforcement has gone up with this law recently. But it comes up in like if you're basically trying to help a
Lobby, yeah, like
lobbying, not even necessarily not legislative lobbying.
Yeah,
but like
PR, like public relation. If you are, essentially, I mean, the idea is that if you are working on behalf of foreign principal and you're meeting with you're pushing an agenda, that the U.S. government wants to know, like, who are you talking on behalf of, like, who's actually paying your bills, right? And so, but yeah, like Safia said, like, it's in NGO context, right? It's a nonprofit that's abroad. If you are advocating, if you're Hill meetings or consulting on PR, or even, I mean, we've had this issue come up on their media strategy here in the United States in order to fundraise, right? Then.
Okay, so it's not just fundraising, because a good example is like Shaka Khanum Hospital in Pakistan that people donate to. It's a cancer hospital in Pakistan, but people they run charities here. I think another one's Texas. I know the Pakistani ones because I get contacted about those, but not just fundraising activity necessitates FARA registration.
Yeah, political activities, PR activities. It is pretty broad.
I'm gonna go to the next slide. Is this still Safia or Shaheen?
I think it was, or I mean, I can talk about it, but I think it was, or I don't know, someone else.
I was just going to say, Shane, I know you had a link that you had sent. Did you want to talk about that, or?
I do.
Okay.
Do we have that link? Do you guys have the hyperlink that we can put up, or?
Yes, I'm gonna try.
Okay. So this actually ties into a lot of what's been discussed previously. Let's see if we can get it.
Bear with me.
I can pull it up here too if I need to. Just
actually, that might be easier. It's just not cooperating with me. I think because I'm sharing, it's not letting me.
Okay, so I'm sorry. I'll be looking down a little bit. But basically, this was really released by actually Treasury. I think earlier this year. I'm not sure. I can check the date a little bit later. But the idea is that so. You want to check a charity the way you would normally check a charity, right? Do they have good governance? All of that. I think we're all pretty clear on that. You want to look at who's on their board of directors. You want to make sure, all of those people are not on an OFAC list. That's all very clear. But then when it gets sort of more complicated is when you start looking at their finances. So if you're giving to a charity that is not fully vetted. Oh, here we go. Perfect. Okay. So we can scroll through this and I'll take you to where the part I'm discussing now. I think I can, oh, I can't control it. Can
Okay.
you scroll down a little bit?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So a little bit more. Okay, perfect. So we just, so we said, know who the board of directors is, but then you also have to say key employees. And that's often less, okay, a little bit more, sorry. That's a lot more difficult to figure out, board of directors is always like, it's there, you know who it is, it's publicly available. Key employees is sometimes publicly available, but it's only like the 5 highest paid employees. That doesn't mean that someone, number 6 couldn't be someone who the US has decided is a bad guy. And just because it says that they have to disclose the 5 key employees does not mean that number 6 could not get you into trouble. So it's really, really important to vet who you're giving money to. And if you scroll down a little bit more, so a little bit more, sorry. So you just want to make sure that, like if you can get, if you're dealing with an unknown entity, an unknown charity. So if you're dealing with the Red Cross, for example, the Red Crescent, International Rescue Committee, World Central Kitchen, which I have an example about in a moment, you should have no problem just being like, okay, these guys are fine. But if you're dealing with someone smaller, especially someone who focuses on one country or one region, who is not as well known globally, because the people who are donating to them are the people who are focused on that country or that region. They have family there, they have ties to that place, they worked there, their religion makes them motivated to donate to that location. That's where you really need to start looking into this. And there is a link, I think, in our slides, which will tell you how you can actually vet these charities. And then we go down a little bit further to section D. When they come to you, if like someone comes to you asking for money in particular, so you're not like, oh, I'm looking for a charity, let me vet them and let me see what's online. But if someone comes to you asking for money, it's even more important to take all of these steps. And then we can go down past the financial practice accountability, because I think we've covered what you need to know in terms of finance. We can keep, go to anti-terrorist. Yeah, there we go. So we need to know, so this is the really important part, right? You want to know exactly who they are. You want to know exactly where they're maintaining a physical presence. You want to know where they're incorporated. And this is really important, because if they are somehow incorporated outside of the United States, but they're sending US dollars from the US to some foreign jurisdiction, that is a place where you can get in a lot of trouble, because it's very likely to trigger some kind of someone who's going to be watching you in the US government. Because when you're moving money to foreign countries that are maybe considered unsafe or difficult in some way, that gets a lot more scrutiny. And so that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind. And I don't know if this is going to just roll into what I was going to say earlier, but I think there's a lot of temptation to say, hey, for example, the masjid, we're all going to pool our money together and make one big donation to this entity that someone has vouched for. That's not usually a good idea. You want to make sure you've done your own homework. You want to make sure that you're not part of a group that is donating to something that hasn't been fully vetted. And I think that's the most important thing, is the vetting. And this is a very good sort of primer for how to vet a charity, because I think a lot of the charities, while a lot of the larger charities do work in some of these areas, for example, Morocco was the example I was going to bring up with regard to World Central Kitchen. Morocco would not take money from the UN. Morocco would not take money from the United States. They would let World Central Kitchen show up on the ground because they were taking money from Spain. And the head of World Central Kitchen is a man named Jose Andres. He's an American citizen, but he's also a Spanish citizen. He was born in Spain. They have an entity in Spain. So through that, they were able to get there. So you would have no problem if you gave money to World Central Kitchen in the US, even if they use that money in Morocco, because they're fully vetted. But if you just gave money to a Moroccan charity that the US government is unaware of, you might be in a lot more trouble. So there are ways to kind of make sure that, you don't want to have a US tie in terms of like, okay, we have US money going abroad that might get us in trouble. But if you have US money going abroad through, say, Red Crescent, that's really helpful. And with respect to Palestine, for example, right now, I think we all know that there's no money getting in. However, what we also know is charities like IRC or the Red Crescent they will still take donations for, for Gaza right now. And then what they do is they silo it because they know eventually they're going to need the money for all sorts of reasons. And so that money will just stay in a place ready to go as soon as they can move it and start using it. But what you don't want to do, for example, is, the masjid has this really nice uncle and he's collecting money for Gaza. And then he's like, oh, but I have this, son in Dubai. So we're going to send the money to him in Dubai. And then as soon as he can send it to Gaza, or as soon as he can get it to Gaza, then he can just do it and it'll be much faster. It'll be much easier. And then we know for sure it's going there, right? It's actually much riskier to do it that way. And not only in terms of the money getting to where you want it to get to, but also in terms of, potential liability for yourself, for your masjid, for your group, whatever that may be, to not run afoul of these laws. And if you want to go down a little more.
Sure.
Sorry, I wish I could control this. And then I think that's it. No, I think we have a little more. But this is basically a checklist of how you can so this is really useful. The last part, sorry, up a little bit. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Right, yeah. So like a little down. This is awful.
Sorry.
No, this is my fault. I wish there was a way I could control it. A little tiny bit further. But so like, yeah, that paragraph right here. This is a very, very useful paragraph about how the charity should be able to demonstrate that it verified who the money is going to. And if you can get that, that makes it a lot easier than having to go through, everything that everyone's described so far in terms of, make sure they're not on the OFAC list, make sure, they're not an individual, make sure they're not an entity, that whoever you're giving the money to, if they can just show you that they've done what's in paragraph 2 here, you should be in very good shape in terms of the US government, right? Like, but they have to be able to show it to you clearly. And I think that's the most important part. So if as an individual or even as a small organization, you're donating to a larger charity, this is what you need from whoever you're giving the money to. This is a very concise way of saying, look at all of these things, make sure there are no problems here. And if they're a reputable charity, they will likely have done all of this. So that should be easily, I think, doable for most charities. But as a general matter, sticking with the ones that we know are very well vetted is extremely important, both for getting the money to be useful, but also for protecting yourself.
Sure.
And I think that's basically the end of what I need to see here. I'll scroll all the way down just in case I missed something, please. Sorry. Yeah, that's all just okay. No, that's all administrative. So that's basically how that works. And I cannot stress enough how much the US government looks at this in terms of, how charities move around money, because they're very concerned that there is a lot of money laundering and terrorist financing through charities. And so they have their eyes peeled. They're always looking. So even if you're really well intentioned, you can end up, in a lot of trouble if you don't make sure you're really doing your sort of dotting your I's and crossing your T's, as it were. So I think that's fine. And then I think later we'll get to the other types of ways of donating that are problematic, right?
Right.
Okay.
And we're right up against it. We'll go a little bit over, I think, everyone, and we do have the CLE code towards the end, so I ask everybody to stay on. As we'll be finishing soon, and I want to leave time for Q&A as well.
Yeah, and I think somebody just asked the recording. Yes, as soon as we get the Zoom link, we will share that, inshallah, with the two organizations, and then I can go host it from there. Can we go one slide back, Asad, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
So I'll try to go quick. I know that it's Maghrib time and all. So generally speaking, I mean, a lot of the concepts that we've talked about charitable giving, charitable trust, they actually originate from Islamic law historically, right? So the concept charitable trust, probably first time you see it through the Waqf. That was very common during Rasulullah's time and afterwards. Hawala, that's agency law, right? So that's also an Islamic law concept, and so forth. I think zakat, and just sort of giving facts and figures, but I mean, America generally is seen to be one of the most generous countries in the world for donations. 485 billion in a year, depending on who you're asking, and religious causes are the biggest, recipient of these donations. for the Islamic community. Zakat around the world, anywhere from, numbers vary because there's no centralized collection, but anywhere from 300 billion to 2 trillion in a year are given in zakat annually. And American Muslims are sort of, I think it's imprinted in our hearts, right? To give money, whether it's in Ramadan or it's sadaqah to a beggar, or it's just imprinted in us. So I think this was a real focus, was that what can we do to help when we're sitting here, when we see tragedies unfold, what can we do? So that was part of the reason for doing this talk. I think on this slide, main thing is that a lot of people do donate with the thought of that getting a tax deduction. I think somebody was mentioning that at the beginning. On their taxes, direct donations to a foreign charity are not tax deductible, generally speaking, under the tax code. But if you go through a U.S. charity and then those funds are ultimately go overseas, those can be deductible. These are just 3 examples: a U.S. nonprofit having an overseas arm, friends of charities, and donor advised funds, which are sort of, well-to-do people have these funds where they sort of control through a JP Morgan as a large donor advised funds organization, for example. And basically, I'll just say as a final point, if you don't do it properly and you try to take a deduction for an unauthorized form of this, right? If you give a direct grant to somebody overseas and you try to take a deduction, you might get an audit, and it's like the old thing that we always tell, right? Al Capone didn't get him on busting prohibition, they got him on taxes, right? So the IRS is always there in the background. And that is something about 501c3s, right? That because they have this, this possibility of reducing your taxes, that they get a lot more scrutiny from the IRS in terms of that. So I'll go to the next slide. Sorry. Yes. So I talked a little bit about, I previously worked at the Texas Attorney General's office. Every state has usually a nonprofit enforcement authority. Usually it's housed in the AG's office. Same here in Texas. They used to have a division which was tied to their financial lit and commercial litigation team. But recently, that's now the charitable trust attorneys and investigators have gone back to where they used to be historically, which is the Consumer Protection Division, which is the largest division in the state AGs on the civil side. The Texas AG's authority is very broad on all states. In fact, I was looking at the Texas Constitution, and it gives authority for the AG to look into corporate charters of any private corporation, for-profit or nonprofit, for any violations of anything against the law, and for judicial forfeiture. Now, that's housed in the Texas Constitution, but at least in recent memory, no attorney general had actually used that power. Governor Abbott, when he was AG, and Ted Cruz was Solicitor General at the time, were salivating over the opportunity to go after a nonprofit or a for-profit, but they never did it. But what they can do is investigation and examination. So books and records authorities, they'll issue what's called a request for examination, and they'll have questions, and they can go look through any books and records, and you really will have a difficult time stopping that examination, right, from coming up. But the quickly you respond to the request, the better when you have one of these findings that happen. Intervening in judicial proceedings, depending on the type of case that your charitable trust, if you're representing a charitable trust or you're suing a charitable trust, in many cases the AG is a necessary party for those proceedings. They have to be notified. Judgments can be voided or voidable if they're not given notice and so forth. And they can come in, either do something or just monitor what's going on, and keep people honest. So donations, if they're done for a wrongful purpose, that's one way that they can come in, right? Probate trusts, just generally when people give endowments, that's usually what they do. Merger control authority. Some states have more oversight. So California, for example, is going to do more merger controls for nonprofits. So hospitals, right, are big nonprofits, right? And then finally, consumer protection, DTPA actions. And that's where we saw a lot of sort of interesting stuff that's happened in the last 5 years around the country, where state AGs are now saying that, hey, if you take a donation premised on a something wrong, right, or a misstatement, you're actually committing a deceptive trade practice, right? So if you remember a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, in Canada, there was a blockade of the truckades trying to stop their parliament and Justin Trudeau from enforcing COVID mandates. So you had like trucks lined up all through Ottawa and stuff. And then GoFundMe started raising funds for the Canadian truckers. And then GoFundMe then abruptly stopped because Canada said, well, we're going to investigate you for funding this riot. And then many state AGs came in and said, no, how dare you take money from people on this premise? So you kind of end up like it's like ESG litigation, right? If you're involved in any of that, where some states say you need to be for ESG, and then some states say you need to be against ESG. You may end up on the wrong side of a political hot topic. And I could see potentially, especially with donations right now to Palestine, and there that you may get enough complaints on either side, right, and pick up a DTPA investigation. So like I just before I came on, Launch Good, which is a very common website, right? It has some sort of stuff going on regarding complaints and negative press on this topic. But really, what state AGs really, given how many there are, the real thing that they're looking for is evidence of bad corporate governance and financial malfeasance, right? That's really what they're looking for in most cases, right? The political stuff you really can't control, but you can't control the checks and balances you have. So next slide, please. So this is just quickly corporate governance. I know a lot of the speakers have said it practically, what to expect and all sorts of stuff. So I'll keep this quick. Again, there are fiduciary duties, there are compliance duties. In a nonprofit, you really don't have shareholders, right? You have directors, officers, key employees, lawyers, and then even on donors in some cases. So you just have to be mindful of that. Shaheen, thank you for putting up the policy. What I was going to point out was the Treasury Department, IRS, and a few other government agency, OFAC, has a lot of good guidance for there, right? That they say, look, this is the best practice that we want. As much as you can, advise your clients who are nonprofits, or if you're involved in a nonprofit, follow that because it's sort of the base requirements, right? It's like the government is telling you follow this. Not saying that they're always right, or maybe that maybe they take an incorrect interpretation of the law, but unless you're going to invest in getting counsel to actually look and fight these kind of First Amendment issues that you have, follow what the government is saying. That's usually the cheapest route, right? Maybe not the best one, but the cheapest route. And in regards to federal regulation, Texas, state laws are not going to. Obviously, supremacy clause says that they can't trump what federal guidance says. They really don't have the resources to do the sort of things that the IRS and the Treasury Department can. But if you have a problem at the federal level, you might walk into a dual sovereign sort of state level investigation as well, right? Especially on forfeiture and things like that. I noticed recently when I filled out a 1023 for a client that they asked specifically, not only, do you have a conflicts of interest policy and how donations are made, but will you affirmatively comply with OFAC guidelines for your charity, which is a big thing, right? I mean, as part of your tax exemption, right, status, you have to agree to that. And then finally, when this topic comes up for disasters and donations in times of war or things that we've seen in the last few months, it's always an emergency, right? Like no one's saying, hey, I got 6 months to figure this out. It's like people are dying, people are drowning. We need to send money now. Don't be the lawyer who's like, thinking of legal issues, right? But that's exactly when stuff happens, right? Like exactly when mistakes happen. We can go to the next slide. So again, just back to that last point, but just basically saying that, hey, if you can do stuff beforehand, right? That's the best time to do it. And maybe you think about having one team that's day to day in your organization and one team that's focused on bigger picture issues, right? So that way, you can have that response, and that. Just quickly, there are, in addition to, we talked a lot about donations of money. We talked, people mentioned donations of goods and services. You can also do it in other ways, right? Speech, donating to certain causes, donating, lobbying politicians, donations to lobbyists. Now, with a 501c3, it's pretty difficult and very limited on what you can do in the political space, right? But you have free speech in other regards, right? So that's something to think about, is that, if you can't do it with your hand, you can do it with, do it with your speech, right? Kind of thing that we have. So 501c4 is another interesting thing that's really not been used so much. I've seen in Muslim organizations, but in other like the conservative movement, has used 501c4s a lot. Like the Tea Party, if you recall, about 10, 15 years ago, was really a 501c4 use, right? Citizens United, that's a 501c4, right? And then some basics, I want to reiterate, I think these are pretty common sense, but in this space, when you have volunteers and lawyers are asked to do stuff pro bono many times, or reduce rates because it's for the, fi sabilillah, right? But no good deed goes unpunished, right? And things like that. So And then, and then again, I think one role that lawyers can really, really fulfill with our JDs and our general, desire to cause a little bit of trouble, right? For a good cause, you can be the person that does actually make your nonprofit think about it, right? Whether as a client or as a donor, be like, hey, did you think out the thing that Shaheen talked about, right? The questions that Fatima raised, like, do you have an export control? You're sending money to Iran, right? So be that person. I think really we can help our, generate our community, really build on where we don't have these, foot faults or very clear faults that we could have alleviated by just being a little bit smarter, right? And complying with the law.
Yeah, absolutely. The takeaway should not absolutely be not. We're not discouraging anyone from donating. We're asking you all as lawyers to help your organizations that you advise, and then as citizens and or members of organizations to help them approach your own charitable giving as well.
And I'm sorry, I don't know if I missed a bullet, but one thing I wanted to address that we didn't get to is there have been a lot of charities recently accepting alternative forms. So we talked about services and currency, but there have been a lot of charities that will take crypto or other types of asset securities, for example. You need to be really, really careful if that's how you're donating, because that is something that the US government has its eye on, particularly crypto, as it's being used for charitable donations. They almost always assume there might be an AML or a terrorist aspect to that. So I just wanted to quickly point that out because I guess I missed it in the earlier bullet.
I will say there are organizations. There's the Wise Giving Alliance, which is affiliated with the BBB, and they help process crypto donations. So they'll immediately, they'll help you sell the crypto so that it's you're not worried about like fluctuation in price, for example. But there are services for nonprofits to help them receive crypto donations.
We're very 21st century. We've got a QR code to scan. Are there any questions in the audience? I've got a couple drop off, and they're welcome to. Like I said, some of this is for my own beneficial as an advisor for different nonprofits. I don't see any questions in the chat, but feel free to submit it, or you can unmute yourself and ask if you'd like. Quick one for Safia, and then I've got one for all the panelists. Safia, you mentioned Islamic organization and registered one. Can you talk a little bit about that structure? And I know that's modeled and by other organizations. Can you share a little bit how that works and how the money transfers, that type of thing?
Yeah, so we have a federated model, which is similar to the Red Cross, and probably other organizations too. Basically, there's like a main organization. In this case, it's Islamic Relief Worldwide. It's based in Birmingham in the UK, and then there will be other independent organizations also with the Islamic Relief name, but it'll be like Islamic Relief USA, Islamic Relief Canada, Islamic Relief Germany. And we're all independent entities, but we have this like affiliation with IRW, and so it's called a federated model basically, where we will make grants to IRW, not only to IRW, but we'll often make grants to IRW, and IRW will carry out the programming. And I think Red Cross does something similar as well.
My next question: we know what we can do on our side. What do you do about the money reaching bad actors overseas? So you want to ensure you've done everything, you've done all the checks, you've got all the compliance, but now money organizations. Any advice there for people who are advising organizations?
Yeah, so I'll say quickly, if you're aware that you're violating sanctions, for example, like you should self-report to OFAC right away. I mean, obviously, you're going to consult with outside counsel and figure out how you're going to do that. But when you self-declare a violation, either to OFAC or if it's a Department of Commerce, issue an export control violation, then the penalties tend to be lower, or maybe you're not penalized at all. Maybe you're given a warning. But the penalties are definitely higher when you do not self declare the violation.
One more I had, and then we'll wrap up. But have any of you all seen any recognition of zakats. And zakat's an expression of freedom of religion. It's a religious obligation. Agencies approach that differently or view that differently with respect to how they view compliance or
I don't see any US agency, and you cut out a little bit, so tell me if I misunderstood your question, but no US agency is going to say you have a religious obligation to donate to this one entity if that entity is, considered a terrorist organization or is led by someone who's on a list that you're not allowed to donate to. That they're never going to find that to be a First Amendment violation. They're going to say you can fulfill your religious obligation in another way. Giving to someone who we're saying it's dangerous to give to because of my religion, I do not see that flying. Murtaza might have some thoughts on this though.
No, I mean, I agree with what Shaheen said. I mean, I think, generally speaking, the country, our history is on religious freedom, in many ways. So donations, and there are countries in the world who even giving zakat can get you in trouble, right? And that is kind of, that is not America. But I think just echoing what Shaheen said, where you give to and who you give and how it's used is that's where the devil is in the details, right? So that's something I think, that a zakat should be treated legally as a donation, and the same rules would apply that we talked about in the presentation, right? About looking where you're sending. I think that's why, I mean, frankly, when a lot of nonprofit, clients come and ask me, I always say, can you just, the question is you can pay me to find out, or you can pay to find out what the answer to this is, but can't you just donate to a US based charity here? Like, is there not Islamic Relief of USA, or, these organizations which are doing great stuff and have done all the homework, right? Donating locally, local masjid, local, whatever you can. Again, that doesn't mean that you don't do a little bit of due diligence, but at least the risk approach is, you're helping locally. And I want to say, I think there's a hadith that even says that, right? Like, give locally, give to your family, give locally, for zakat at least. As a first need. So I can see that corroborating. Now, if you want to fight and do that, again, that is possible. I don't know if that case is going to win, donating to certain organizations, but I think, you can find out.
right. I want attendees for making time this evening, both tonight and in the last few days to prepare. I want to thank the DFW Muslim Bar and the Muslim Bar of Houston, especially for together and getting our CLE approval. It's been my pleasure to be your moderator of contributing. We all are obviously making the well for our brothers and sisters overseas, and so anything you all can do, both from your own personal giving or your advising using your legal skill set, please do. Again, if you could just acknowledge our speakers and make the offer them.
This is on demand CLE, so if any of your friends missed this, they can watch it until August 17th of the coming year. Thanks to Abdul for getting the on demand credit.
Yes.
Thank you all so much.
Well, thanks for attending. Thanks, everyone. You guys did fantastic. I'm sorry with my curveball questions.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too. Assalamualaikum.
Brothers.
Thanks, Shaheen. Good to meet you. Thanks, Omar. Assalamualaikum.
Thank you.